Hello. Good night and good evening, and welcome to the Comics Experience Graphic Novel Club meeting for the month of January. Our selection this month was a Black Bolt by Saladin Ahmed and Ahmed or Ahmad.
Ahmed.
I got it right.
You did.
And Christian Ward, who
Yes.
could not be here because he's in England and it's 4 o'clock in the morning in England. Thank you, sir, for coming. And,
Thank you for having
and
me.
being happy to talk to us about this great book. Everybody read the book? Yeah? Did you all read the book?
Yes.
Yeah? Did everybody like the book?
Yeah, really good.
Very good. Okay, that's what we like to hear. So usually, as the regulars will tell you, that usually my first question is so why comics? Which I want to ask you, but I want to do it in a kind of a roundabout way because you are not primarily a comics guy by trade, I guess.
Yeah.
You are a prose writer primarily. And so your first book, Throne of Crescent Moon, nominated for a Hugo and a Nebula, and you won the Locus Award and for your first novel, which is pretty goddamn cool, right?
Yeah, I was pretty lucky, and I think it was a decent book, and I was lucky. It was right place, right time kind of thing.
Yeah.
But I'd published some short stories before that, and write some poetry here and there. So I'm sort of all over the map as a writer.
So what led you to come and do comics?
Well, for me, I was really, comics are what taught me to write. Before I ever read prose as a kid, I read comics, and so even when I started to write not only fiction, but even before that, when I was writing poetry, there was this kind of Marvel Comics influence in everything from like poetry to essays and things like that I was writing, and this sort of geek, the Dungeons and Dragons stuff was kind of coming in, even in the kind of more literary stuff that I was writing. And so for me, after the first novel was published and was nominated for some awards and stuff, a couple of years after that, Marvel actually came to me, based, I think, primarily on the kind of fact that what they were looking for a writer for, Black Bolt, is this sort of science fiction fantasy corner of the Marvel universe, right? And so they were coming to me based on my science fiction fantasy writing, and it felt like an immediate and natural fit. I mean, I think about these characters a lot. So I think about comics as a form, but I've also, specifically superhero comics, it did a lot to teach me about story, period, And the form is a different thing, and learning about the form as an adult artist, a writer, is a different thing than kind of just reading it intuitively as a kid. But certainly, as far as storytelling and as far as writing per se, I've always been learning from comics. So coming to write them just felt like that was, I think, always going to happen. Maybe.
So when you're, how did you write it? Did you write full script? Like panel by panel breakdown, or like what they call Marvel style, where you just write the plot?
No, yeah, I did. I had no idea there was an option for anything other than full script, so it was just after I'd pounded out a few issues of Black Bolt, that I started seeing people talking about this much sketchier style of script writing. I was like, what? You could do that? So, but I think coming to it as a prose writer, for me, to a good degree, the story is inseparable from the words that are telling it, right? So if I'm thinking about a episode in Crusher Creel's life, right, I'm thinking of him telling the story in his own words as I'm thinking of the events, right? It's not like I'm thinking this happened to him and then I have to write. It's sort of like it's in his voice, and so I can't really imagine the whole idea of there being this style where there's somebody separate writing plotting and scripting is mind-boggling to me, because how can you do that? Although the deeper I get into the form, the more I can see how they are kind of separate functions in comics in a way that they're not in, say, a novel.
Yeah. It's interesting because even Marvel doesn't really use Marvel style any longer.
No, it's pretty rare.
It's not a particularly efficient way of doing comics.
No,
either.
It's kind of just an extra step, really. So, I mean, I for the first bit of outlining for myself, I may do that. I may say, okay, page 1, I know this is going to happen. I know this is going to happen. But even when I do that, there tends to be, like, say, a sentence of dialogue or a bit of a caption of caption prose, just for the flavor for myself, so I know what's really going to be there. So, yeah.
So what was or I shouldn't say what was the challenge, because maybe there wasn't a challenge. Was there a challenge for you from the muscle that you're used to of prose, where you're writing descriptively, every sentence is descriptive and counts and is on the page, versus a comic script where only the editor and the artist are seeing a whole lot of what you're writing.
Yeah.
Was that a challenge for you? How did that?
It was a learning process, because I'm sure that if I were to go back and God knows, maybe we'll do some sort of edition like this, but if I were to go back and look at the scripts of the earliest issues of Black Bolt versus, say, the later issues and scripts on other projects, I'm sure that the early scripts are more prose-like in even the stuff that's just for Christian and the editors. I'm a literary writer, so I can't. Something at me rankles at, like, writing a pedestrian sentence that's just straight up, boring prose. And so even when I'm just writing stuff and they'll kind of, like, enjoy it and laugh at it, I think, because even when I'm just writing, like, the notes that are like, here's what's in this picture, in this panel, it's alliterative or whatever. So on the other hand, though, it doesn't have to be perfect. And that is extremely liberating. Writing a novel is a very exacting, and particularly for me, in my own style. Other people are not all the same, but the way I write prose is just I'm pretty unforgiving, for myself, and it's different. It's a collaborative thing when you're writing a script, and so it's not the final product that you're putting out there, and you'll have a chance to change the dialogue. You'll have a chance to kind of tweak things. You'll interact with the artist, and that will change things. And so it's just the stakes feel different each step of the way. So it's been a learning curve, but mostly a really enjoyable one.
Yeah. So when the editors came to you, did they come to you specifically with Black Bolt?
Yeah.
Okay.
Will Moss.
It wasn't like we were interested in you writing.
Well, actually, the story is a little bit more complicated than that, because Willow Wilson and I sort of knew each other from various circles, had interacted, and a number of people here and there had sort of floated the possibility of me doing comics writing here and there. And I had a brief discussion with Sana Anant, who's now creative director. I don't know what her title is, but co-creator of Ms. Marvel up here, and which your camera doesn't pick up. But there's a picture of Ms. Marvel on the wall.
Giant Marvel.
And we had a brief discussion that was sort of like, she knew about the novel and stuff, and it's sort of like, yeah, you should do something for us, but if you come up with a pitch, let's talk. And it was, and I sort of had some ideas for some pitches, but I was working on other projects and never really got anything into a polished enough form to take to Marvel. And so that was sort of in stasis and might have led somewhere. But then Will Moss, who's editing a lot of really weird, cool books at Marvel. Editors don't really get known, but he's doing Black Panther, he's doing Squirrel Girl, he's doing Thor. He's been doing a lot of stuff that's taken chances kind of stylistically in terms of bringing in other kinds of writers, stuff like that. America. So all those books were sort of like, I think he has a really broad, quirky vision, and he was looking for somebody to do Black Bolt, and again, kind of based on the fact that I'd written a fair amount of kind of out there sort of fantasy and science fictional stuff. he thought I would be a good fit, and so we just started bouncing stuff off of each other.
Did they pitch you on for Black Bolt? Did that come attached with any of the television show stuff attached to it, or was it
no,
whatever the hell you want?
No, those are totally separate. I mean, they're literally separate companies. I mean, they're all Marvel, but different coasts and everything. Yeah. So, and it was funny because I started this gig. I took this gig, and nobody knows who the hell Black Bolt is outside of comics, right? And so it's not like Iron Man or Thor or, something like a Captain America. And so, people know Marvel now, right? Even people who don't know comics know what Marvel is. And so, I would say, I'm writing for Marvel. Well, what are you writing? I'm writing this thing, Black Bolt, and you don't know who the hell he is. And then, it was maybe within a couple months of starting to write this that they announced the Inhumans show, and my editor and I found out about it when it was like in Entertainment Weekly. We didn't really, it's totally separate. So it was like, and they had no, there was like zero pressure to like okay, make this tie in or these elements fit or any. There's none of that.
Did Will ever say to you why Black Bolt of all of the characters? Because I had just sort of assumed, I think, that Marvel was trying to put together a bunch of Inhumans books because they knew that the Human show was coming out, not necessarily to tie them in directly, right, but to capitalize on the wave in some fashion.
I don't think so. I mean, I think that there was, and kind of, to a degree remains. I mean, there's going to be maybe a bit of a lull with Royals wrapping up, but. I think they were just kind of looking to kind of revitalize Inhumans, and one of the ways you do that is you kind of break a team up and you sort of like try and do something different with the different characters. And so I think Al had this idea for a sort of space operatic thing that he did beautifully, I think, in Royals. And they didn't have much of an idea for Black Bolt, except that they wanted somebody to really do a deep dive on him. This character's been around since the 60s and had never had his own solo, and really nobody done a lot with him. I mean, there were like some Denny O'Neil bits in the 70s, and Ann Nesenti did some really cool Inhuman stuff, and then Charles Soule did some stuff, but it's nobody's really had really gone really deep with this character, and I think that was what they wanted to do, was just do a book that highlighted Blackagar Boltagon. And so I happened to the prison thing actually came about because the one nascent idea that I had that I was getting ready to take to Sana, but I didn't think she would take seriously, was a Crusher Creel book, and it was going to be about him in prison. And but the reason I never took it to her is the pitch just never quite cohered, and it never I had one idea for how it would work and another idea, and it never happened. And then Will came to me with Black Bolt, and he was like, well, we want to kind of get him away from the rest of the Inhuman family, and it's like, okay, let's put him in prison. And it just instantly clicked with this kind of other idea that I had, and I think it worked. I think it worked pretty well.
That's why we picked it as the book of the month. Did you have any trepidation dealing with a character who traditionally doesn't speak at all?
Yeah, sure. It is hard, and you're sort of constantly shuffling the tricks to use, right? So at one point, okay, he doesn't have powers, and we can allow him to speak. And it was a sort of thematic thing to me, the idea of kind of, who gets to speak, whose story gets told. It's a big thing in prison when people get locked up. People telling each other stories is a big way that people stay alive and kind of pass the time and stuff. And so to think about this character who never really has had a chance to do that, being in this really screwed up situation, but it providing this chance for him to to do that, you know, it was just, I mean, I'm a nerdy literary writer, and so like being able to kind of dig into all this thematic stuff and political stuff, even with Jack Kirby superheroes, you know, it worked pretty well, I think. And in terms of Black Bolt himself, you know, it was an excuse to use sort of prose captions. I think most people got what I was trying to do. There's certainly some detractors who are like, "Oh, this purple prose in the captions," and I was like, "Well, it's kind of intentional, right? There's this bit of homage to the kind of Lee Kirby sort of flavor in the language, and he's, you know, it's sort of there's sort of omniscient captions, but they're really from his they're sort of limited third person, right? Yeah. And so and he thinks like a Lee Kirby voiced character, right? And so that's, you know, that's on purpose. And in the later issues, you know, after he lost the ability to speak again, you know, we've got Blinky in there, so she's a cheat. She's a psychic kid who can explain things, you know, and you have to
Medusa role, essentially,
right? Exactly, right. And so you have to find these crutches, and you shuffle them around and try and kind of not lean on one any too much, you know.
It's just interesting to me that they went to a prose writer. So as we were talking about before, a lot of the prose that you're writing is only ever seen by the editor in terms of description, and then they gave you a character who you can't really dialogue. It's like your number one and number two weapons are kind of taken away from you, and yet it's still this beautiful lyrical book, and that gets into the character's head. I think it's a neat trick. I was just really struck by, you know, losing both of those things as a prose writer. It seems like that must have just been a real interesting challenge.
Yeah, no, that I mean, I do think that as I say, when I'm writing a prose novel or a short story or a poem, even, you know, I'm pretty excruciating with myself. That's why my second novel's like several years delayed, right? Is at the sentence level, and so I think that in stuff like having these narrative captions, for instance, I'm a little more kind of trained to be attentive than folks who are kind of really good at hammering out dialogue but don't think at that prose level. And so, you know, maybe there's a weird way in which that was a strength, I guess.
I overheard you while you were talking to people while you were signing in terms of the next book in the series. I think you said you're writing about 100 words a day.
And are you talking about the novels?
Yeah, the next novel. Yeah.
Oh yeah, no, 100 words a week, which is extremely slow.
Okay.
So you know, which is just to say that, you know, people ask a lot about where the second book is at, and it's being written but very slowly, and that just kind of, you know, I essentially was trying for several years to write a second book. I burned and destroyed a hard drive with a draft and a lot of kind of dramatic stuff, and basically had an old-fashioned kind of nervous breakdown trying to produce the second book. And I got to a point where I was like, I'm going to write this at the pace that I can write it at, and that might mean that it's, you know, one of these books where it's like 7, 8, 9 years between the first and second books. And I didn't write a cliffhanger on purpose. I tried to write a book that had an ending, you know, even though there are unanswered questions. There's a click shot ending to the first novel, and that was intentional. And so the second book will come when it does. I've been really excited to get into comics because rather than just kind of be like, where's the second novel? Where's the second novel? I'm still doing that, but I'm also like writing other things that people are digging. So
and the thing that I find interesting is that comics have a relentless production schedule,
and it's been beneficial for me, actually. It's been great because writing stuff every month, and now that I'm working on a couple books at once, I'm always working on something. I'm always either doing you know, looking at an editing pass of something, or outlining something, or looking at you know, somebody's layouts for something. So it's I don't sleep much, but it's been really great, and the collaborative aspect of it too is really the big booster. I think is working with other people, working with artists and editors so closely and so relentlessly that it's like it's this real team feel, which is a very different thing than being locked in a room with a 100,000 word thing that you're supposed to produce by yourself over the course of a year. And I have a wonderfully supportive fiction editor, and she's an amazing mentor, but it's just a different kind of relationship than you have with a monthly comics editor that is just sort of like you're in constant contact with.
Yeah. And then you're not only doing the Marvel book, you've also got Abbott.
Yay!
From Boom.
Yes.
Which is out.
Yes.
Technically, this is out next week, but we have some advanced copies.
Yeah, it's so exciting. The first physical copies I'm holding here in the store.
Yeah. So how did this come about? That you're working. A lot of times when people get brought in, you get brought in at Marvel, and then you tend to get loyal at Marvel. And I was surprised almost that your second book is from Boom. So.
Well, it's interesting. So the editor of this book, Eric Harburn, is I'm from Detroit, and he's actually originally from Detroit as well. And after the first, my novel kind of got some attention, he actually came to me a while ago and was sort of like, have you ever thought about comics? Thought about create your own comics, and I'd love to talk to you about this. And I sort of like, again, as with Sana at Marvel, I was sort of like, yeah, I've got some ideas, but too busy. I have small kids at home. It was taking up a lot of my energy. And so it was just, it kind of kept getting put on the back burner. And then when I started doing Black Bolt, a number of folks working at various other companies came to me and said, hey, think about this, think about that. But Eric very kind of forcefully came back and was like, I really want to do something with you. I've been wanting to for a long time, and was just sort of really, and I had this sort of nascent idea for the book, and I'll talk about the book in a second, but as soon as I floated it to him, because there's a Detroit connection to the book, as I'll talk about in a moment, he was just incredibly enthusiastic, and everybody at Boom's been just super, just kind of gone the extra mile for it. So I'm pretty happy.
Nice.
And I don't know. Can I talk about?
Yeah.
What it is?
Please,
Yeah.
talk about it, yeah.
So the idea for Abbott itself is sort of basically my tribute to a type that I've always been interested in comics with things like, say, Hellblazer, but even with more so with TV and things like that, things like the X-Files and going further back, Kolchak, the Night Stalker, right, from the 70s, right? I mean, it's just amazing performance. And that's the kind of occult investigator, the paranormal investigator, right? The kind of person who keeps digging at the story that nobody else really seems to believe in, and uncovers something grisly that we should be paying attention to, but that we're not paying attention to, right? And I was actually watching a lot of reruns of Kolchak specifically, and at the same time I was watching. My terrible secret is that I'm a cheesy procedurals, junkie. So such a lot of Criminal Minds with Aisha Tyler, a recent cast edition at the time I was watching it, and she's just a super compelling actress, and I was kind of mashing them up, and I was also just for a lot of kind of personal family reasons thinking about Detroit in the 1970s and stuff, and all this stuff was sort of percolating together in my mind. I started to think about, like, well, if I were to finally tackle this type, this archetype that I've been wanting to tell a story about for a while, it would be different. It would be, it would be a different sort of person at the center of that story than has traditionally been at the center of that story, right? So rather than kind of a smug little fox Mulder, right? I thought it'd be interesting to see, like, well, what happens if you have somebody who's kind of, to a degree, on the margins of power for that society. And so I started to, and at the same time, as I said, I was thinking a lot about the city I was born in, Detroit, period drama is like, it's such a thing right now that it's hard not to start thinking about, like, I want to do something with clothes and cars and, the music and, everything that evokes, this nostalgia. And so Detroit in the early 70s is this period a few years after the, depending on one's point of view, the rebellion or the riots. And it's this period where there's just a lot of political upheaval in the city, a lot of change, and it's often kind of depicted as this period of decline, but it's also this period of kind of renaissance, particularly for black people in the city. And there's like just interesting things going on with journalism and a lot of echoes of our own time. Nixon is president, right? There's like just all sorts of like, there's, police brutality stuff going on. So all of this was kind of like percolating in my head, and and it just kind of started spewing back out as this book about like this kind of chain-smoking, hard-bitten journalist woman in the early 70s, black woman, who's kind of digging at this story, and because I'm me, it has to involve monsters and shadow magic and blood sacrifice and stuff like that, right? So the story, kind of in a nutshell, is that Elena Abbott is a tabloid reporter in Detroit in 1972, and she's the only black reporter at the newspaper she's working at, and covering everything from kind of organized crime to police brutality. Yeah. So she's not liked by a lot of different people and a lot of different groups in the city because of this. And she's this kind of haunted woman who years before watched her husband, the kind of love of her life, killed before her eyes by shadow monsters. So we don't quite know what they are, and nobody really believes her, but she knows they were real. And she's kind of not been the same woman since. Yeah. And we pick up the story when bodies start turning up around town that cause her to believe that whatever this was that killed her husband, it's back. Mm-hmm. And so she's got to do something about that. And I don't know, it's a story that's dear to me for a lot of reasons. I guess part of the reason is the protagonist in this story, in tribute somewhat to Kolchak, but also kind of my own ethics, is a journalist, yeah. Rather than, the heroes in these stories are always cops or FBI agents. Yeah. And while there are some good folks among those groups, I have a lot of kind of personal reason and there are a lot of political reasons to kind of not think of those as the groups to go to for heroes. Sure. And so to me, journalism, especially in this era right now, we're thinking a lot about kind of what journalism can do for us. Yep. So to make a reporter a hero was kind of like, I don't know, it was kind of an intentional choice there.
Yeah, nice. Is there any, or what are the differences for you between writing a Marvel script and writing a script like Abbott?
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, certainly there's, I guess the easy and straightforward answer would be like there's more freedom. It's a little different. It's interesting and kind of pleasantly constrictive at Boom, because it's actually, we are kind of avoiding the M rating there. And so it's, it's still kind of like code comics, right? So you'll notice that the swears are very, they're very particular swears, and there's, there are choices made that are skirting certain kind of mature things. So not in terms of the depiction of the subject matter, but just literal kind of like artifacts from the code. And that was both weird and fun to work with, but that was the only real restraint, And whereas working at Marvel, certainly. Now with Black Bolt, I have pretty free reign, and I kind of feel like I got spoiled doing superhero comics my first time out because, and even with this second project I'm doing with Marvel Exiles, it's it's my little weird corner to do my funky thing in, and it's not like I'm doing like the main Avengers book or something like that where it's hyper monitored in terms of continuity and stuff like that. But even so, it's a big universe. It's a corporate universe. It's got a lot of moving parts, and so there's oversight. And with Abbott, this is my world. These are my characters. I tell them, what things should be like mostly, and it's just it feels very different, and tonally it's very different. This is like we're going for something that has a bit of a retro feel, kind of intentionally, and it's just we don't have to kind of. There's marketing people, obviously, but it's just a different kind of. It can be its own thing in a different way.
I don't want to dominate the conversation because I always do. Does anybody in the audience have any questions they'd like to ask? Yes, please.
Going from prose to comics, a lot of times authors, they forget that it's a visual medium. It's just the comics end up being really, really wordy. Did you ever have an issue with that when writing Black Bolt?
You tell me. Yeah, I did. I mean, I could, if I'm going to critique my own work, yes. I mean, my great sort of cheat and blessing is that that's exactly what it needed to be with the first issues of Black Bolt, right? And so what was really my prose excess worked stylistically, and people were like, "Oh, that's fucking amazing," I kind of was like actually babbling, but what I learned pretty quickly, working with Christian specifically, Christian Ward, was how to back off, and not so much that I learned, and I mean, here's the thing: I've been reading comics all my life, right? On the one hand. On the other hand, I'm also, it's like I've got stupid degrees in English. I've taught, I think about narrative lots. So I think about form a lot. So once I started writing scripts, I was thinking visually. I was thinking about like, what do the comics I love do between panels and how does that work? But still, only so much. I was still thinking like a prose writer, and I was still overwriting, and I was probably being over-directive to Christian, right? And he really helped me start to think about, well, you don't need to spell this out because Black Bolt's doing that in the panel, so you don't need to tell us he's doing that right here, right? And it's been quite an education, and it's a blessing. I mean, every bit of that I can take off of my chest feels like, oh shit, you can draw that. That's right. I don't need to like write that out. Thank you. So it's still a learning process though, and I think there's a difference between learning to back away as a prose writer and really learning to write visually. I'm learning to from the ground up visually, and I'm still learning that.
Do you think that going forward for Black Bolt, you're going to keep that kind of more heavy narrative because Black Bolt can't talk, or are you going to pull it back since that?
There are some different tricks up our sleeve. The captions aren't something I'll ever back completely off of because I think it gives us this intimate and yet distanced thing that I really like doing with him. But there'll be a bit of variety. That's about all I can say about it. Yeah.
Spoilers, I guess. Everybody said they read the book, but if you're watching this. Is it hard to get permission to kill somebody at Marvel? I mean, a character. I mean, like.
It's a process. Yeah. It's a process.
Is there resistance?
There wasn't resistance, but you have to justify it. And here's the thing. It's superhero comics. It's the Marvel Universe. So you always have to write in an out, So, will, our now hero remain dead forever? Probably not. It's Marvel Comics. I mean, who has stayed dead? I mean, you can probably kind of count on your hand the number of characters who've been dead forever, and and I wouldn't want to do that to him. I like the guy, the big gorilla. So, part of the deal is, even if it's very baroque and obscure and is like requires 8 no prizes to get to, you have to have justified some out for a future writer to pick up on, right? But they were. I mean, I think it was a pretty good death, and they did too, and they were pretty cool about it.
Good.
Yeah.
So you have a shirt on for Dungeons and Dragons.
Yes, I'm a nerd.
So you play Dungeons and Dragons. You ever
I do.
think about writing like RPGs instead? Or
Yeah.
something like that?
That's another thing that like I kind of learned to write doing as a little geek boy, was like my little supplements and stuff like that. I have thought about probably one of the greatest thrills of my life was that the most recent edition of Dungeons and Dragons, the 5th edition. They have so back in the day in the first player's handbook in the first edition of D&D, in the back of the player's handbook they had a list of like, here's the inspirational reading for, and it was Conan and whatever else it was, Fafford and the Grey Mouse, or for Gary Gygax, the guy who wrote D&D. And I guess about 4 or 5 years ago, the 5th edition of Dungeons and Dragons came out, and they did a new one, and they put my novel in it, and it was like, just twitching for days, right?
Cool.
So the guys at D&D have actually been really cool to me. I went out to a convention and gamed with them and stuff, and certainly my fantasy novel, Throne of the Crescent Moon, is it's pretty transparently a D&D love letter, right? Like there's a paladin in there he's got a turban on and he's called something else, but he's basically a paladin, right? And it's I hope it's also deeper than just the D&D campaign, right? But that DNA is there in that book. As far as like formally writing for RPGs, I've kind of mumbled things with some people here and there, but it's like so many other things. It's like I'm so busy. So eventually it's certainly not beyond the realm of possibility.
You mentioned your upcoming Exiles project.
Mm-hmm.
I was just sort of wondering if you talk a little about that, like how you got into the project. Was it given to you, or did you go for it? And what appeals to you about it? What's the differences between writing for it versus Abbott versus Black Bolt?
Yeah.
And also, is it Will Moss again, or is it a different editor?
So it's it's my 2 editors at Black Bolt, Will Moss and Sarah Brunstad. Sarah's a little more. She's one to watch out for as an editor, and she is a little more upfront on this book, but it's still Will. So Exiles is coming out in April, and it's an ongoing from Marvel. It's a team book, and it's a reboot, a pretty hard reboot of a kind of beloved sort of X-Men-ish spin-off book from the early 2000s, and which is a book about alternate universe, alternate reality. In the case of the old book, mostly X-Men. In the case of my book, it's a little bit more of a mixed group. But alternate reality Marvel heroes forming a team and sort of hopping around alternate reality Marvel timelines and fixing things, right? And the old book had several pretty long runs, actually, with all sorts of like weird Marvel Universe trivia and Easter eggs and stuff like that built into it, and the kind of hallmark is a kind of motley crew team of bizarre sort of incarnations of Marvel heroes. So, excuse me, my edition of the book, which I'm doing with Javier Rodriguez, is coming out in April, like I say, and it's going to have 5 members of the team. The first is Iron Lad, who's last seen in Young Avengers. Our version of him is a bit different. He's he's younger and hasn't gone through the Young Avengers experience yet, and he's a little bit of a emo boy, kind of a little bit. He's got some bitterness in him too that he's working out, but also a super genius. He's a lot of fun to write, and he's also destined to become Kang the Conqueror, which is kind of, bound to give you a bit of a complex, right? So he's fun to write. There is Wolvie, who is a cartoon version of Wolverine, basically, right? So back in the day in X-Men, there was Mojo, who was this sort of reality TV supervillain. I don't know how to explain him, but he created these adorably hideous creatures called the X-Babies, right? And they were like these little pint-sized but kind of tough X-Men, right? But his rival, Veach, created an even more sickeningly adorable kind of chibi version of the X-Men, right? Like the closest thing to Muppet Babies that the X-Men could be, right? And so the idea here is that version of Wolverine has popped out of this cartoon reality and has joined the Exiles. So, and part of it is maybe me trolling Wolvie fanboys a little bit, because it's Wolverine, but he's like this big and got big cartoon eyes and hearts popping. Friends are fantastic, right? So and then we've got a version of Valkyrie, sort of not technically from the reality that's designated as the Marvel Cinematic Universe, but she's basically inspired by Tessa Thompson's performance in Thor Ragnarok, right? So she's this kind of mead swilling. Now she's bigger than Tessa is, right? Ms. Thompson's kind of small, but she was very swaggering in the film, right? So my instructions to Javier were sort of like to kind of draw her as big as Ms. Thompson sort of inhabited the space of in the film, and so she's this big, broad-shouldered, mead swilling, sword swinging kind of fighter, and she's great. So she, Iron Lad, Wolvie, Ms. Marvel as an old lady, basically, right? So Khan is the name of this character, and the idea is, yes, exactly, you have to, right? Khan! The idea is basically kind of like, what if Kamala went Sarah Connor, right, for about a couple decades, and so the idea is that the IVX event that happened a bit back and never really became a big full-blown war between Inhumans and mutants does in one reality, and then humans get pulled into it, and we've got this essentially big global factional war that lasts several decades, and this over a series of decades and events that we'll find out about during the book. A lovable little Kamala, again gesturing to this picture of Kamala that's up on the wall, becomes a kind of bitter, sort of 90s post-apocalyptic soldier with lots of belts and pouches and a big laser rifle, right? So it's not coincidental that she looks kind of like Cable or Bishop or something like that, right? But she's a little more than just pastiche, right? And kind of how she gets to this tragic place is going to be part of the story. I mean, Willow and I are friends, and Kamala's, a really important character to me. So this is not just a thing of like, oh, Kamala Khan with a laser rifle, but a character that I'm hoping kind of we'll see an interesting journey for. And then rounding out the team is the team leader, Blink, who is sort of beloved neon pink mutant from the Age of Apocalypse storyline, and she was the team leader for the Exiles. She's the one kind of team member holdover from the old run of Exiles, and she's this kind of veteran time hopper, but who's seen a lot of really brutal stuff, but still kind of maintains this buoyant spirit that holds the team together. And she's going to be going on some interesting places as a leader as well, going to some interesting places. So it's, for me, a kind of, you asked about, after that long ramble, you had asked about the differences between that and, say, Abbott or Black Bolt. Black Bolt is sort of my broody, middle-aged man solo book, right? And this is my kind of buoyant, young, teenage, brightly colored team book. It's very much kind of owes a lot to like the Claremont X-Men and stuff like that, and is about the kind of team drama between characters and different kind of personality types clashing and also coming together to work together, and it's also about time and history and stuff like that. They're hopping between different eras. The original run of Exiles really focused mostly on kind of Marvel history per se, and did so really, really well. And I'll be doing that as well. Like I just got done doing a really fun Namor take. He's a hippie. It's going to be pretty fun. But I'm also digging into kind of American history a little bit more. So we've got a kind of reckoning with the atomic bomb. We've got a reckoning with slavery. There's some kind of heavy things happening in there. I hope and pray in that Claremontian fashion of sort of still having this swashbuckling soap operatic team having fun together and drama together, but also thinking about some heavy stuff sometimes.
Yeah.
So.
Did you pitch them this book, or did they pitch you?
Well, it was pretty wild. It actually started out with, which actually ended up happening with a different writer along a different thread. It ended up happening that Will asked me to pitch a reboot of X Factor. And the pitches I gave him got weirder and weirder, basically. And started getting into time travel and alternate realities and all of this stuff. And some of the team members started to shift. And he said, this really sounds more like a reboot of Exiles. And actually, I guess. And again, sort of as soon as he said that, it said, okay, yeah, it all slid together. So,
nice.
Yeah.
Nice. What comics do you remember reading? Like, what's the first comic you remember reading?
Wow, that's pretty hard.
Which is probably not the first comic you read.
Yeah, I mean I think I'm trying to do a deep dive and remember really what the first one I really read was, but I mean probably the ones I remember kind of reading over and over again first were early Secret Wars.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Transformers comics, a lot of stuff around 1983, 84, stuff like that. G.I. Joe comics. But you know what I think the very first comic I ever read was from the 70s. I was probably about 5. Was The Secret Society of Supervillains.
Oh, nice.
Which was a DC comic where with the bad guys as the leads, right? And so it was a cover with Gorilla Grodd smashing like a robot Superman, a robot Green Lantern, stuff like that, like into the garbage can, right? It was like, first we'll smash these robots, then we'll smash the real Justice League, right? And,
I remember seeing that.
cover.
I remember seeing that comic on the newsstand and going, "Mom, I want that comic there. I don't know what it is, but I want that comic." That
Captain
period of
Cold
time where
and
the
stuff.
covers were just these amazing things that drew you in.
That were never, the promise was never fulfilled. But
it's so weird how comic books, especially on superhero books, the covers are all so like iconic pose rather than like those creative ideas which just made us crazy when we were kids.
We'll have, I mean, that's one thing I'm looking forward to actually with Exiles, is to go a little more bonkers. I mean, Christian has done some stunning covers, and some of them are pretty, actually kind of wacky. The Kid Black Bolt cover was just inspired, but Exiles, we're going to be able to do like these really weird sort of wacky takes, I think. So.
Oh, I know what I want to ask you. Did you know that Christian was going to be your artist on this when you started writing scripts?
No, gosh, I think I wrote the first script before
Okay.
But I became familiar with his work pretty early in the process, but I didn't know his work necessarily. Will was just like, okay, here's the artist I'm thinking of, and I was like, oh God, I hope he's good. And you look at him, and I was like, oh wow, oh yeah, this is awesome. And but the funny thing is, I wasn't even ready for what he was going to do with this book.
Right.
I was like, I saw some of his covers and some fill-in work and stuff like that he'd done, some great Black Panther and other shots, but he took it to the next level when he started working with me on Black Bolt. Not with me, but when we started working together, he was just, for both of us, I think we really kind of almost treated this more like a creator-owned book so far, and it's been really great to see people respond to it.
So how did that change your writing process? Once you knew that he was the artist and what he's capable of, and the mood that he's capable of,
Yeah, I think again, I started to learn to back off a little bit more, and let him do some of the storytelling, and in terms of layouts in particular. Again, there's part of me that it's less because I want to be a control freak and more just I feel somehow like I'm cheating if I don't kind of, be pretty specific with layouts, but I've learned with him to be like, okay, here's a fight scene. Here's some beats that should be hit, and just you do that. I mean, in particular with layouts, he has a lot of strengths. I mean, color, for God's sakes.
Yeah.
But in terms of kind of innovative stuff going on from panel to panel and transitions and stuff like that, stuff with the gutters and stuff like that, it's just, I know he will do something brilliant,
Yeah, yeah. Do you ever do your own thumbnails just to see how something flows on the page?
No, I've never done that. No.
Okay.
I never thought about that, huh?
It's an idea. I don't know. Right then. No. Cool. What else did I want to ask you? I don't know. Who else has a question here? Someone must have a question. We do. Yes. Perfect. Oh, thank God. Go.
With how you said Exiles are kind of like timeline jumping group, are they ever gonna run into Black Bolt, or are you gonna keep them as far?
I wouldn't rule out anything. I definitely had to resist the temptation with the first arc. It doesn't happen in the first arc. I'll spoil that much. But that was me resisting temptation. How could you not want to do a crossover between your own two books, right? But no, it hasn't happened so far. But I definitely think that would be a cool bomb to drop at some point. So we'll see.
I had a question, or kind of comment question. But one thing I really liked about the book was the humility that Black Bolt had. He was broken and seriously broken, coming up from being this king to being in this jail and still having a lot of fight and vigor inside of him, but then having that broken by the jail by the jailer.
Yeah.
Thank you. And so by the end of it, though, he had really kind of come full circle with that vigor kind of reinvigorated, but at the same time he lost something in the process, but at the same time gained a lot of humility. Is that how do you want to carry that forward? How are you going to take what's happened in this episode and move that forward with the rest of the Black Bolt series?
Yeah, starting with this character, it's interesting because I like writing likable protagonists. It's very fashionable right now to have a dickhead as the kind of main character of whatever your series, and I'm not that guy. I like people that people like and that I like writing and that I would want to be friends with. And Black Bolt was not that. When I started digging deep into this character, because when Will came to me, my thoughts were, okay, he's got this iconic costume, he's got the cool wings, he's got the, he can't talk, he'll blow things up with his voice, he's a king, he's sort of, I knew a few things about him, and the more I dug into him, I'm like, yeah, he's not a great guy. He's done a lot of bad stuff. He's really arrogant, and I think to you can either sort of double down on that and be like, yeah, he's a dick, but he's a genius or whatever. I don't like that kind of storytelling a lot. So I'm much more interested in seeing like, well, how is this character that I have a kind of beef with to start with? How do I relate to this character? How do I meet this character halfway, right? And kind of instilling him with some humility, I think, that he hadn't had before, was important to me to do that, and also kind of trying to see where he was coming from in a way that maybe previous writers had been less interested in, was pretty important to me, and definitely that's part of going forward what we're going to see. I mean, to my mind, he was pretty severely abused as a kid, right? There's this weird arc, or this weird part of Black Bolt's arc where he was like experimented on by his dad right from the time he was a fetus, and no one's ever like, oh, and that's crazy, right? It's just like oh yeah, super science, right? And so I was kind of like, well, let's think about maybe if that's got something to do with why he's kind of a jerk, right? And without making it too like, daddy issues, and going too deep down that hole, I did want to kind of dig into some of that stuff, and we're going to get a little deeper into some of that stuff in the next couple issues, actually. So
Cool. Follow up? No?
I mean, I'm just kind of curious about how, like, I mean, it sounds like you want to, like, sort of, like, play on the character's vulnerabilities and have that be some of the attributes that are going to, like, sort of, like, come through in the character development. And, but is that going to soften the character in any sort of way?
it's interesting. It's been really interesting kind of interacting with Black Bolt fans because he hasn't had his own solo series and because he's been this character that's been around so long and he's this kind of cult favorite character. There's so many people who are like, oh, finally Black Bolt's got his own book, right? And mostly people have been really cool and gracious and responded really well to what I've been doing. But there's definitely like this small portion of Black Bolt fans who basically like him because he's the most powerful character to some minds, or at least certainly a contender on Earth, right? One of the most powerful characters on Earth in some of the iterations of him, right? And really, what they've been wanting for decades is just see him kick ass, right? And I mean, I'm a D&D nerd. I like stats, right? Like I relate to that. So it's I have tried to provide these moments where we get that satisfying blast, right? I had to have Black Bolt use the master blow, right, and stuff like that. These little things, but ultimately, I'm suspicious of power, and I think characters are much more interesting when we're looking at them vulnerable. And when we're relating to them on that level, rather than we're just sort of like reveling in them, sort of reveling in them, sort of like just being having the biggest stat block or whatever, right? I mean, again, at the same time, I'm a fanboy. I try to provide those moments. There are more of those moments coming, but but ultimately, yeah, he's been humbled. And that's a lot of what I'm interested in doing, is seeing what happens to us when we're humbled. Right?
Is there any challenge that you see taking what was a supporting character and making him a lead? I don't know if that.
I don't know if he was a supporting character. I mean, really, it depends how one thinks of the Inhumans, and I guess it's the recent push that's kind of reoriented them.
But I'd say historically, they're not what you consider.
They're more of a Fantastic Four.
They're always kind of off on the side.
Yeah, sure.
You go to them.
Yeah.
They're enigmatic, and then you don't see them again.
Yeah, sure.
Right? So
it was absolutely a challenge in that, but mostly it was a relief and a freedom, You know, I mean, like people are like, well, you should write Iron Man, and I'm like, Jesus, it terrifies me. The thought of like contending with the depth of the continuity there, with the depth of the sort of dynamics, you know. Iron Man has a relationship to everybody in the Marvel universe that is like probably 10 issues on even minor characters and hundreds of issues with you know, his dynamic with Captain America, for instance, or something like that. Now, you don't have to contend with all of that as a writer, but I try and honor most of it, you know, honor the general trends. And the thing is, when you're taking on characters who are less defined in their place and things, you have a lot more freedom. Yeah. And so Black Bolt mostly was like this set of kind of like little archetypal touchstones, right? He's a king. He can't talk. He's his people have been hidden for a long time. He's, you know, this and that. And I picked up on those and really had a lot of freedom to kind of work with those without having to kind of contend with 8,000 other appearances.
Yeah. Abbott is 6 issues? Is that
5 issues?
5 issues. So you've written the whole thing?
I'm just knocked out issue 4.
Okay.
So wrapping up issue 5 probably in the next couple weeks.
Okay, and both Black Bolt and Exiles are ongoing and continuing moving forward. That's a lot of comics to be writing. I mean, that's 3 scripts a month.
Yeah.
Let's say, you know.
I'll be happy when I hand in the last issue of Abbott, and that may, other things may end up happening. Her story may continue in some form, but there'll certainly be a break there. And yeah, it's a lot. I'm not sleeping a lot, but it feels good to be writing tons, and telling all these different stories, really exploring. I mean, I just wrote my first comics script. I did have a project that never quite went anywhere. That was a sort of very exploratory half a script with Alex DeCampi, and it was amazing. And maybe someday we'll resurrect it. But really, my first comic script I wrote like maybe a year and a month ago, something like that, 13, 14 months ago. And I've written a lot of scripts since that first one. And it's been really fun exploring all the different flavors and tones and subgenres, even within this narrow sort of like superhero and adventure comic. Even with Abbott, it's still a kind of heroic comic. But even within that narrow scope of heroic kind of adventure comics, there's so much to explore, and I've just started to do it. So.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. If there was a character that you could write, if you could pick one.
God, this is such a hard question now because it's so professionally fraught, right?
Oh,
it's
I suppose. Okay.
Like
you don't have to answer
like
it,
you're actually making the pitch. Here's the maybe the diplomatic way I'll say this. I had a lot of fun writing Steve Rogers' Cap for the issue 9 of Black Bolt. He's only in there for a few pages, but I got feelings writing him, which I'm a hardcore lefty and very much like kind of, almost anti-patriotism symbols and stuff like that. But Steve's always had a place, in my heart, since the late 70s. And so writing that little snatch of him was pretty great. And I definitely write more of him.
Okay, and let's reverse it then. What character do you not, under any circumstances, want to write?
It's funny. I'm like, I think the only way I could ever write Bruce Wayne would be as a villain. Yeah.
It kind of is.
I'd love to write Bruce Wayne as a villain, but I don't think, and probably the same for Tony Stark. Honestly, again, I'm kind of a pinko. So,
All right. Well, are there any other last questions from the audience? No. All right. I want to thank you, Saladin, for coming out.
Thank you.
Especially coming all the way from Detroit.
Yeah. Thanks.
want to thank you for Black Bolt. We loved this book. It was a great book. Let's hear some applause. Yeah,
Thank
there
you
go.
guys so much.
Some notes for people. Spy Seal is next month's February's book from Rich Tomaso. Rich is going to be here on February 28th. So put that on your calendar. And then our March book, I'm really way out ahead now, is going to be The Prince and the Dressmaker by Jen Wang. And Jen Wang is going to be here on March 16th. So that's pretty exciting. She's really, really good. This has been the Comics Experience Graphic Novel of the Month Club. Again, thank you so much for coming out, and I hope to see way more comics from you going forward.
Thank you. And
Thanks.
thank you guys for coming.
Yeah.